Hi, everyone. We will get started very shortly. All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Julie here from the Confidential team. And I would love to extend a very warm welcome to all of you joining us today for the webinar, Data is the New Perimeter. Thank you so much for carving out precious time. I know how busy everybody is. But we are honestly very thrilled to have such a diverse group of security leaders, innovators, professionals with us today. And as we all know, the landscape is constantly evolving here in cybersecurity, keeping us on our toes. And today we are going to dive into some of the most critical challenges and opportunities facing us right now, and how we may look at the future to anticipate and protect ourselves against this sea of threats. If you want to flip the slide there, Karine, I'm going to quickly walk you through what we will be covering today. So we're going to start out by identifying the most pressing issues that security leaders are currently grappling with. Next up, we're going to take a hard look at the limitations of zero trust network access and walk through example scenarios that may leave us vulnerable in our own organizations. Then we're going to explore how the zero trust approach to data security really needs to evolve in response to these challenges. And then finally, we'll discuss how to achieve a balance between enabling your business to harness the potential of AI while also ensuring that it doesn't come at the expense of your security posture. Throughout the session, we really want to share as many insights, strategies, and steps that you can take and apply within your own organizations. So therefore, we're going to leave a chunk of time at the end for Q&A. Make sure that you drop your questions into the Q&A chat bar. You know where it is at any time throughout the discussion. And I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. They bring a wealth of experience and knowledge. So the first up is Karim. He's the co-founder and CTO of Confidencial. He's got over 20 years of experience under his belt in cybersecurity and cryptography for distributed systems at top US R&D labs such as SRI and HRL Laboratories. He's led multiple R&D projects designing and implementing large-scale, secure, and privacy-preserving distributed systems for DARPA, DHS, IARPA, Air Force, and General Motors. His research has resulted in 75 plus peer-reviewed papers and book chapters, and over 30 granted patents and test of time awards from the Internet Society's Network and Distributed Systems Symposium. I also have with me our very own head solution consultant, Karine. Now, she spends all of her days engaging with security leaders, delving into their challenges and priorities, and also identifying any friction points that they may have. So with that deep understanding of their unique needs, she tailors a lot of solutions that align with their goals, ensuring that they can meet their challenges head on. So given her expertise in navigating these very challenges, I'm going to hand it over to Karine to kick things off for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. Thanks for that introduction. Really happy to have you all join us. So we're sort of going to start the conversation, looking at the stark sort of reality that faces us all in terms of security breaches. So, I'm sure you have all been personally affected by one. And, of course, in today's environment, it's really hard to go more than a week without reading about a major data breach in the news headlines, even more than a day. In the past couple of weeks, that list includes CBiz, Dick's Sporting Goods, Park and Fly, Patelco Credit Union, Canyon Designs, and Toyota. And these are just the newsworthy companies. In 2022, 74% of security leaders reported that their organization's sensitive data was breached at least once. And 70% of these breaches led to very significant costs, disruptions to their business, and reputational damage. So the bottom graph here points out that the majority of the challenges faced by security leaders when securing their organization is centered around protecting the data they hold. The inconvenient truth about data is that you need it to operate. You can't just go ahead and delete everything. Data is crucial to the modern enterprise. It powers dashboards, analytics, and now AI. And that really enables the enterprise to make strategic decisions and drive efficiencies within its workforce. So really where, these current approaches falls short. There must be millions of security solutions out there. And when organizations attempt to improve their data security posture, they're often met with many challenges. The solutions typically impact the usability of the data. It's typically cumbersome from employees to use, and therefore they just try and circumvent them altogether. And they're complex to implement, and they might not be compatible with all the other systems that are currently in play. And furthermore, with the frequency of attempts and of attacks on the enterprise, we sort of get stuck in this loop or the cycle of reactivity. Resources are constantly straying with cleaning up messes, which leaves little room to sort of step back and evaluate, the entirety of the security strategy holistically. And it's a vicious cycle of outdated methods, increased risk, increased costs of breaches, and strained resources even further. So having said this, we know that we need to constantly be improving our security measures. And as stated in the 2023 Cloud Security Forrester report, the majority of security leaders are looking to spend these resources on improving their zero trust security posture. Actually, 84% of security executives have said that improving their zero trust security posture is their main priority over the next 12 months. So Karim, having worked, in the forefront of cybersecurity innovations for over 20 years, I'd love to get sort of your take on what zero trust is and why perhaps so many organizations are choosing to invest in this posture.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the intro, Julie, and for everyone who's attending. So first of all, zero trust, it's a paradigm. It's not a single, there's no single solution. It's an approach, and it's essentially a more accurate way to describing it would be it's security and maintaining trust as it goes to zero. So how do you protect your infrastructure and data as the trust in possibly even the infrastructure itself or the users goes to zero? So far, people have been thinking about it at the infrastructure level. So with micro segmentation of networks, having access control at a perimeter if it exists, at the applications, at the servers, at the cloud infrastructure. And the way they do this is by continuously verifying users, validating the devices, and limiting access and privilege. But it's always been discussed so far at sort of the infrastructure level. That's a first step, and it's important because we know that this works. A very good quote I've heard is that essentially zero trust is the commercial world catching up to what the classified and defense world has been doing for decades, every day, all day. Compartmentalizing access, limiting access, continuous verification, and that's really what's happening in zero trust. Now, the devil's in the detail. If you start doing this at the network access level, what this picture is showing is you can think of it as you're building essentially a castle to protect your assets, which are basically the data and obviously your infrastructure too. And then let's say you have that bridge, which you can basically, you're using it to gate access to the infrastructure and data. And that bridge, maybe you have checkpoints, you have multiple checkpoints. But then the problem with this model is once you're in, you might have some checkpoints internally, but they're not as frequent and they're not around the data. And I think that's where things are lacking, and that's where things will happen.
So from that perspective, is that, the main reason why zero trust might not be the silver bullet?
Right. I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of marketing hype, so there is no silver bullet in cybersecurity. I mean, historically, people have always been talking about defense in depth, so multiple layers of defense. And zero trust is just another manifestation of this, but with finer granularity, with continuous verification. So it will improve the bar significantly. It will make it harder for compromises to have larger effects. But it doesn't solve everything, because if you approach it from the perspective of just securing your perimeter network access, or even at the application, the data is still vulnerable. So a very natural evolution, and that's already starting to happen in the market, is data-centric protection in addition to protecting the infrastructure or the cloud or identity and access.
So maybe we can take a look at sort of 3 scenarios where the traditional zero trust approach might fall short in the modern enterprise. So let's say we have sort of an authenticated employee uploads a document containing sensitive information to unauthorized SaaS applications. From your perspective, sort of where does this approach fall short?
So, I mean, first of all, when you actually look at a lot of enterprise applications that are cloud-based and SaaS, unfortunately, a lot of them require you to upload your data just in the clear. I mean, a canonical use case would be contracting and e-signature workflows. Most platforms there, when you're getting an e-signature, whether it's integrated into a workflow system or document management system, or you're doing it on the web, you're uploading your data to the SaaS provider, and then they serve your data from there, and the data sits there, and you have no control over it. So the problem with this is you have basically no visibility into what happens with that data afterwards. Sure, there's some like compliance-based frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO that force the vendor to inform you and protect the data, but the reality is there's no technical approach for you personally as the enterprise to protect that data. So if that SaaS provider gets breached, and it has happened, your data is gone. And that happens all the time, unfortunately. You've mentioned a couple of them. So ideally, in an ideal world, we could use something like cryptography to still get the workflow without exposing the data to the SaaS provider, but allow them to compute on parts of it. And there's some technology heading there already with privacy enhancing technology.
Awesome. And what about this other scenario, which I think we're seeing happen more and more frequently today, the concept of sort of bring your own device, approved device, and it still gets infected with double extortion ransomware, which essentially infiltrates the data that's stored on that device.
Again, similarly, even if you have zero trust network access, you're limiting the user's access to the infrastructure. You're authenticating them every, 5 minutes or 10 minutes. If the laptop or device is compromised, the data is sitting on the laptop unencrypted, even if you have disk encryption, once you're logged in, and it gets basically exfiltrated. So of course, other solutions that maybe like data loss prevention or other monitoring solution can help, but if you don't have them, just having a zero trust network architecture is not going to help prevent this from happening. So we're basically trying to point out that there's more needed. And the natural evolution of this should be leading towards another layer on the data itself.
And if we haven't convinced you enough yet, there's, we got a third scenario here. Let's say a malicious insider downloads or compresses and encrypts documents with potentially sensitive data to exfiltrate them without alarming any security system.
Again, if the insider, this is even more difficult because in all the previous ones, we're talking about outside entities and cloud infrastructure. Here, if an insider that has access, even though it's limited, let's say don't have access to all the databases, but once they have access to a database, they basically have access to all the data in it, or it's like some file shares, unless you're adding another layer, limiting their access once they're into the infrastructure that's hosting that data, they could basically exfiltrate all that data. So just doing zero trust, continuous access at the storage level or the servers, it's not going to help with something like this. And this happens, unfortunately, more often than you think.
So maybe we can take a step back and just look at, the evolution of the threat landscape. And we're going to see more instances where maybe this, traditional zero trust approach falls short in an effort to safeguard data. So we sort of touched on it earlier. And, if you look at a typical organization today, on average, they're using about 130 SaaS applications, and that's up from 18% last year. So that's quite a large, attack vector that you essentially have no control over. With the rise in remote work, there's an uptick in situations where employees are bringing their own devices. And then, for those of you who have been living under a rock, we are in an AI boom, and AI is now being used by attackers in very creative ways to try and infiltrate the system and the data.
Right. So, I mean, unfortunately, there's that asymmetry still exists between attackers and defenders with AI. And I'm going to claim that unfortunately, it even helps the attackers more because it's much easier to analyze code and finding a single vulnerability to exploit than using AI to make sure you cover all vulnerabilities. So that trend will continue to unfortunately just accelerate of more sophisticated attacks and with even fakes, the deep fakes. I've heard of cases where people are in Zoom meetings like this, where every person in a meeting was actually a deep fake on video, and they caused the transfer of 25 million accidentally, even though the CFO did all the right things and thought they're getting all the right approvals on the chain, the command chain. So what will help is a way that is mathematical and future proof, and obviously like cryptography is one of the tools that has been working if used correctly, and that's a big if, and implemented correctly. So it needs to be a fundamental aspect of scaling zero trust and really how it's going to evolve. And you can already see that the US Air Force has released a document several months ago on the zero trust roadmap for the entire DoD, and it's all talking about data-centric security and pushing zero trust to the data, not just the infrastructure and access. So we're going to see how that will play out. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while. It's going to be a transition period. But starting now and planning for such transition and figuring out exactly what data to protect and how, it's going to be paramount. If any organization that doesn't sort of jump on that bandwagon, I think is going to be left behind, no question.
Yeah, so I guess you talk a little bit about, how commercial is just catching up to what, the DoD is doing. If we look at, a typical zero trust implementation maturity curve for the modern enterprise, you'll notice that it shows sort of data-centric protection at year 5 to 7. And that's behind, IAM, behind workloads, behind device and network protection. But really knowing that, 72% of organizations are getting breached at least once every year. Can you really afford to wait that long?
In my opinion, no. I mean, unfortunately, the way cybersecurity in the real world is, it's highly compliance-based and compliance-driven. What you're showing here is the maturity phase of organizations. As you see, data comes at like year 5 or 7. I think that's outdated. I think data should be there from number 1 because it's actually what matters. Data is the target of a lot of the attacks. So exactly, it should look ideally something like this. Now, it's very easy to say, but how do you do it in an actionable, incremental way? And the first step obviously would be just understanding and identifying the sensitive data, where it resides, mapping it, classifying it, labeling it, which is easier said than done. But once you do that, then you need to come up with a data protection program and policy, and it has to be automated to scale. That's where things fell short in the last decade. When people tried to do something like this, it just doesn't scale. But we do argue that today, with the improvement in some automation and machine learning and AI, plus the ability to really apply cryptography in a smart way and for unstructured data specifically, and with the advancements of secure computation, we're in a much better place, and this can happen. We just have to start, and it is the single most effective way, I think, of stopping a lot of attacks that could face any organization, whether from insiders or an outsider, having a proper data protection program and evolving it over time. It's going to be a process. Identity is important. I am here, but and they're closely tied, because when you try to protect data, you tie it to identities or groups or attributes in your IAM systems. The issue, though, is that identities have been around for a while, and these systems, and we get phished all the time. I mean, most of the big hacks end up being that somebody got their credentials and MFA and SIM swapping and such advanced techniques for especially sort of the more financial world. And because the data itself wasn't properly protected, it was only the IAM system that's gating everything. Once they're in, basically it's a free-for-all.
So maybe, I know we touched on it a little bit throughout sort of the explanations, but maybe we can talk about, what is this shift up zero trust approach that that you've pioneered, and what this concept really is, all together.
So historically, I mean, there's been shift left of basically pushing testing and security to the left of the development process. What shift up is basically arguing for is that zero trust so far has been applied at the infrastructure and network layer and applications. So this is referring to the networking stack that's implemented on every laptop, server, device, the TCP/IP stack specifically. The highest layer is the application. And what we're saying is the zero trust concept should be pushed up to the application layer, but not just at the logging into applications, but to be pushed inside the data of these applications, so that you have basically another layer of defense that is fine-grained, that is as close to what matters the most, which is the data. So coming back to the analogy of the castle, you can think of it like, at the end of the day, what matters with a castle is it's the king, it's the queen, it's whoever is inside it, the treasures and the people. So it's as if we're putting armors and chess boxes or so that have locks on the assets inside the castle that matter. But we're saying basically push that level of protection to the actual data inside the application in an ideal world, in a way that's horizontal and basically works across different applications. And how you do this is by basically looking at the most common data formats and document formats, and doing the protection in such a way that you still preserve their native encoding. Like if you're protecting a PDF document, if you completely encrypt it, which is what historically people have been doing, completely destroys the encoding and no application can open it and recognize it as a PDF. But if you can protect the sensitive data while still retaining that encoding, the applications won't break down. Some of them might, but at least now it's a tunable parameter, and it will minimize disruption, and it has a path forward to be incrementally deployed. And over time, a lot of applications will be updated to operate with something like this, I do believe. It's just, how do you do this incrementally in a programmatic way? So this is exactly what I was, this is exactly what I was talking about, that so far people have been talking about zero trust at the network and transport layer and maybe at the application. We're saying that the most effective way, and the one that hasn't been exploited, but is shifting up the zero trust approach to work inside the application layer of the stack, and specifically inside documents, so that they're still usable across the different applications and workflows. And this is starting to work. I mean, it's a new concept. It obviously introduces some complexity, but with proper automation, you can tame it. And over time, it's gonna be, in hindsight, like it's a no-brainer, because the data itself is what matters. If the data is protected in some sense, even if everything below fails, your protections at the transport or network layer, you still have that layer of protection that works across systems.
Absolutely. And, there's sort of 4 pillars that goes, that comes with this approach. I was wondering if you could sort of give a little explanation of each of the pillars that sort of make that approach work. And, for organizations that are new to this concept, how can they get started today? What are some simple things that they can start implementing in parallel to the other strategies in their security posture that, can help them, get closer to protecting the data itself?
Right. So I mean, number one would be that there has to be buy-in and will to actually do something about data protection beyond just monitoring it and having pretty dashboards, but actually do something that works. I mean, a quote I heard from a CISO is, "I don't need another product that gives me blinking lights. I know I have a lot of problems. I need a way to solve them and solve them at scale." So first, one has to understand obviously what data they have, and this is closely tied to the industry, the sector, how they're regulated. There's some local laws that might change from country to country, but at the bottom line, I mean, you have to first be able to survey your data, understand where it is, and that's where products like data security posture management and classifiers and risk registries have been historically operating. The issue is, once you have that view, you need to be able to effectively come up with a program or data protection policy that allows you to inherit whatever you have in your identity provider ICAM systems, and enforce that at the data that you have identified. But then at what level do you enforce it? I mean, you can of course enforce access at the folders, at the cloud. You should do that all, but what we're advocating for is adding a layer of fine-grained encryption. And fine-grained simply means that you're now using encryption as a scalpel, not a hammer, by trying to protect only the sensitive portions of unstructured documents. And this could be at the page level, or could be at the paragraph or object. This has been used historically in the defense and classified world, where you have every paragraph is marked to whether unclassified, classified, top secret, and then depending on that marking, different groups have access to it. So we're saying, why not apply the same concept that has been working for decades, compartmentalize information to commercial applications? But you need to do this basically in an automated way while preserving the document encoding so that you don't break workflows. And then once you do this, you will need basically monitoring software to monitor the usage of and viewing of such fine-grained protected data, and run analytics, who's using what. It gives you a new insight that you couldn't have before. So, I mean, those are the four pillars. There's obviously more detail that depends on the exact infrastructure, but at a high level, when you're starting on that data protection journey and thinking about pushing zero trust, you have to think about these four elements.
Absolutely. And, maybe a simple, example of this would be finding SIN numbers or finding salary information and encrypting those within documents within an organization, and then sort of scaling up from there to IP and paragraphs and making it more complex. But you can start very simply and small.
Exactly. And because the protection happens sort of at a fine-grained level, you're going to minimize the disruption to existing users. Some users might not even feel that there's any difference. Some might feel there's difference depending on what data they're dealing with and their credentials and attributes. But exactly the point that you said, like, you can start small, experiment with it, and then build from there. And that's typically what happens in IT infrastructure. An important point, though, that I want to emphasize is, once you add the protection, this is orthogonal to other types of protection you might have. You can still encrypt the whole file while it's stored on disk or in the cloud. You can still encrypt it while it's being transmitted. You can still use advanced polymorphic encryption or other privacy enhancing technologies to compute on the file that has a portion of it encrypted. This all still works, and it's an additional layer of protection. But what you have with this fine-grained protection of the data itself, that if the file accidentally is leaked or is sent to the wrong person, or you have misconfiguration at the folder access level, or you, for whatever reason, the transport protection, there's a man-in-the-middle attack, or there's vulnerabilities in the libraries, which we have seen in the last decades. Even OpenSSL, some of the most advanced cryptographic libraries are open source, and a lot of people have looked into them, get exploited. You have another layer of protection which you didn't have before, and that's important.
Absolutely. And one more thing I'll touch on is people might look and say, what's the difference between just redacting a piece of the document or tokenizing it? And really what that comes down to is you're still able to recover the data and use it if you are allowed to access it. And then you also don't have to have two different versions of the document, because when you redact something, then you've got to save two different versions. So you're not, yes, you can redact it. It'll be protected when you're sending it out to somebody else, but you're still saving that, unprotected copy on your, within your storage system. So there's quite a few differences there, but typically those are a couple of things I just wanted to point out. So there's obviously challenges that organizations will face when trying to implement this type of approach. So maybe you can sort of outline a few of the challenges and how we can circumvent them.
Right. So, I mean, the most common one is, would this work at scale? And what kind of disruption will I see in my workflows and for the users? And will it slow us down? So, and that's a very legitimate concern with any new technology. And especially encryption has a little bit of a bad rep that it's very expensive, and it can be if not used appropriately. So luckily, there's been some amazing progress in the last decade in terms of machine learning and LLMs, I'm sure everybody knows. So if architected correctly, these tools, they will never be 100% accurate. I mean, like anybody who claims they have a model, I mean, even the most advanced models, they still hallucinate, they do errors. We know that. So the question would be, how do you design a system that doesn't require the accuracy to be 100%? I'm going to claim that this is such a big problem that even if the accuracy is 80, 90%, that's already solving a big problem. And as long as you basically are providing a way for users to access the data that was inaccurately identified as sensitive, and then protected, but then you're allowing them to easily see it if it or request access to it if it was mislabeled. It's okay if these tools are not 100% accurate, and they're going to get better over time. And there are things that could be 100% accurate, like old school regular expressions and NLP. I mean, we know these work, catching credit card numbers, social security. When you start to go towards the more sort of generic IP, what does IP mean? It means different things for different industries, personally identifiable information that's beyond just numbers. Then it becomes tricky. I'm going to point out here that we're all used to sharing on cloud platforms where somebody is giving you access to a document and then you realize they did it incorrectly. You try to access it, you can't. And then you request access, they grant it to you within 5 minutes. I'm saying a model like this is clearly working. People are used to it. And as long as it doesn't happens maybe once out of 10 times, it's okay. I think people will live, and it will get better over time. The second one is to be able to do this fine-grained protection manually whenever needed, but actually in an automated way in the background so that users don't even feel that this is happening. And we can do this while preserving the document formats. And this is already a working technology. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's about what are the most common document formats that have sensitive data that you need to apply this for. At some point, you hit a point of diminishing returns where you've covered the 20% of the document formats that contain 80, 90% of the data. That's already a huge undertaking. If we do this if we all we focus on in the next 5 years is, as a community and industry, is figuring out what are the 20, 30 document formats that we can make this work well for, it's going to be a significant step up in data protection, because you still have all the other solutions. And then finally, if you are a organization that doesn't have a well-established data protection program with well-established policies and a process to update them automatically, that's not that easy to build. That I've been talking to some large SIs. That process of surveying the data and coming up with the protection policies takes months. We're talking about like 6 months. So these programs typically take a year at least to sort of get off the ground, and then you have to renew it. It's a process every year. So unless there is automation and tools to help you maintain such policies and patch them and make sure that the data is consistent with the latest policies and having even usage monitoring, it's not going to work, because these policies are very quickly going to get outdated within a year or two, and as people leave and new teams are formed. So so those 3 pillars basically would be the biggest challenges, but they're all solvable. And over time, as you introduce it and actually starting to work, users are hopefully not going to even feel that this is happening, because it's all happening in the background and the disruption to their workflow is minimal.
Absolutely. I find sometimes when you sniff a solution that might fit the requirements, you always kind of try and go 100%. And, you know, if something is 90% or 80%, you're like, oh, this 20% isn't covered, but you kind of forget about the fact that, yeah, but the 80% is being covered, right? And that dramatically reduces the risks and the costs, you know, that you currently have today. So, yeah, we really do need to realize that this will get better over time, and that there are solutions right now that will dramatically improve, you know, the security of your data today. So I guess just kind of bringing this full circle to the scenarios in the beginning, and sort of, you know, showing how this shift up zero trust approach would solve some of these challenges. So the first scenario for compromised SaaS application. So if you did have something that was essentially running and protecting your documents before you upload it to that SaaS application, that would allow you to have the sensitive parts protected. The SaaS application could still do what it needed to do with the document. And if it was breached, then you're sure that, you know, those components of the document would not be accessible. The second one was sort of that ransomware infected, you know, bring your own device. So again, when the data is protected in this format, in this way, doesn't matter where it goes. It doesn't matter where it's stored. You can download it locally on a different device, and it still remains protected. So if that device is, you know, exfiltrated and, you know, it is compromised, you can rest assured that those documents will not, those components of the documents will not be accessible. And that is one key differentiator from, you know, those traditional access control models that you have on, say, Google Drive or, you know, Microsoft Online, Microsoft Suites. And the third one is that insider threats scenario. So again, because you have granular protection on different parts of documents, there's going to be a lot less people that can access those sensitive information on those documents. So they might be able to access the document, but they won't be able to, you know, download and access the sensitive parts and then encrypt them for themselves. So those are really kind of 3 scenarios where this shift up approach would really help, you know, protect against some of those infiltrations or attacks.
Correct.
So we're going to just go into, I know this could be a whole topic on its own, and we probably will have that, we'll have that at some point, but just talk a little bit about AI and data security, and really how you can use AI to help, you know, improve the protection, but also help accelerate the deployment of your security solution, sort of as you were touching on a little bit earlier. So, you know, from what we've seen 2 out of 3 organizations studied in a 2024 IBM cost of data breach report stated that they're deploying security AI and automated workflows, which is a 10% jump from the prior year. And they're saying that when deployed in prevention strategies, organizations see on average $2.2 million less in breach costs compared to those who are not using AI and automated workflows. And in this chart, you can sort of see where organizations are using AI in what sort of parts of their security operations.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to just point out that obviously the preventive, similar to medicine, the most cost savings you're going to get is if you're using a preventative approach. Detection is, of course, important. Investigation, response, sure, you'll save money. It's already too late. So, I mean, that's also another part of what we're advocating for, that sort of shifting up zero trust to the data. It's happening proactively before the data is even used. As soon as the data is created inside an organization by humans or systems or ingested from the outside, you should apply such protection to it. That way you have basically the protection throughout its life cycle, and you'll get the most effectiveness from that. And we see it already in dollar numbers.
Absolutely. And that would compound on itself, because if you're preventing it, then you won't spend time on the detection and on the investigation, the response part as well. Sure. So, from sort of this AI-enabled shift up zero trust posture, from your perspective, where are some areas where AI can help accelerate in the prevention strategies of data protection?
So, I mean, you have them listed here. Obviously, the detection part, there is no single rule or approach that will apply to everything. I mean, at the end, engines for identifying, labeling, classifying data will use different rules, with different old school, like natural language processing, new LLMs, and whatever is going to come in the years to come. The classification of data and applying labels to them. But then what's new is, now that you've classified the data, identified it, and mapped it, how do you build a protection policy and a program that scales and maintain it? And that's a new area where AI could help in recommending appropriate policies, whether for large parts of the system or individual files even, and then applying the automation of encryption in the backend. That has to be driven by, it's basically a step that comes once we've done the detection and classification and figured out what the policy is. And then once you have that level of encryption, every time somebody views a document or a system is going to access a document and use it, they need to first have the appropriate rights to decrypt those portions. So there's a lot of new logs and events that could be mined, again, with new AI tools, and produce reports to understand really the usage of protected and sensitive data at a fine-grained level. And this is something that simply doesn't exist today, especially if you want to have such visibility once the data is not in your infrastructure and is outside. So I do believe that there's going to be a lot of interesting applications of anomaly detection, whether based on old school machine learning or the newer LLM based ones, to help automate such analysis and gain insights, and possibly even have sort of alarms, or early alarms that something could be going wrong, whether by insiders or potential compromised accounts, or even outsiders.
Do you see sort of any risks associated with using AI in this way?
Yes, there's always the risk of relying on automation without humans in the loop. So the trick would be, how do you develop systems and tools that minimize the false positives? Because what we have seen historically, whenever machine learning and automation was used in intrusion detection systems, the false positive alarms were too high that it sort of became, people turn it off. So there's always that risk. But I'm going to claim that this is a little bit different since here, it's less likely to be a false positive if somebody is trying to access a document that doesn't have any information to them or a group they're part of, and they do this repeatedly. That's a very strong signal. There's no false positive. They're like intentionally trying to look into something that they should not be looking into. And in terms of the detection part, as I mentioned, you can basically work around that, err on the side of being more protective, and then allow people to request access seamlessly through mechanisms like what we have today with document sharing. The biggest challenge we're seeing when people get super excited about the potential for automation, all these steps, but what they don't want is to expose their data to the big AI providers, and that's where basically things will break. So what I think the future will be, it's going to be hybrid. You're going to have solutions that can be deployed in your infrastructure, whether on-prem or in your own cloud tenants. But then if your data is already in these hyperscalers like Azure, AWS, or GCP, your data is already there. And if it's not protected, it's okay to possibly then rely on their AI. And that's already happening. But the thing is, once you protect it, the question is, will you still give their models access to such data? And that's a decision that will have to be made by each organization by itself. But there should always be the option of running these models in someone's tenant, and even like in the future, running them in what's called confidential computing, trusted execution environment, so that they're really protected, and the data that is decrypted and exposed to them is not exposed to the rest of the cloud infrastructure. I do believe it's going to be a hybrid of all these approaches, and different organizations will be have different risk tolerance to exposing their data to the different models.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess just to wrap this up, we've got some key takeaways, and then we will take question and answers. But Karim, I'd love for you to sort of leave us with 4 points that we can remember from this session.
So exactly, those 4 points, if anything from this last 45 minutes, would be that one, data-centric protection is not just a buzzword, that there's actually something there, and something that makes sense and has been working for decades in the defense and classified world. Let's bring it to the commercial world. And I do really like this sort of describing zero trust as basically, how do you have protection and cybersecurity that works as trust in the user, in the infrastructure, in the automated agents, approaches zero. So number one is, I think it's just a matter of time till every organization realizes they have to adopt a data-centric protection approach in addition to what they're doing, and possibly replace some of what they're doing that's not effective with that approach. Two, compartmentalization of sensitive data is not a new idea. It's just, how do you do this effectively at scale? And possibly start strategically. Let's say you're an R&D lab or a pharma company where your IP is the most important. Start focusing on that part, because it's so, like, there's so much investment in it, that it's worth protecting for the decades. AI is obviously here to stay, so it's just a matter of time till we have all to use it. So we have to lean into it and use it for what we can, but be realistic about the shortcomings of accuracy, processing power, and how expensive it is. But over time, it will just get cheaper and more accurate. So might as well start with platforms today that are leveraging it from the beginning. And finally, this is dear to my heart, is at the end of the day, cryptography has also been around for decades. It is one of the tools in cybersecurity that works if used correctly, and that is a big if. But it's also future-proof, meaning who knows what's going to happen in 10 years in terms of attack techniques, automation. One thing, though, I guess if I was a betting man, I would bet on it, is that properly designed cryptography and use cryptography is gonna withstand the test of time. So any solution that claims that it's going to be future-proof for the next decade has to have cryptography as an essential aspect to achieve the vision of zero trust and shifting it to the application layer. And whereas more advanced computing and encrypted data becoming more practical, this will open a very interesting avenue for, yes, parts of the data are encrypted, but I can still compute on them. So the rest of the data that's not sensitive, maybe I don't encrypt it at all. Now the compute on it is still doable with today's techniques, and it's cheap. And then I'm sort of reserving the heavy computations on encrypted data to what really matters.
Awesome. So that about wraps us up. Julie, I don't know if you want to open up the floor for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a couple come in. Let me see. I'm just going to choose two since we're running out of time. So the first one that I've got for you is, what steps can businesses take today to start integrating AI and automation into their data security without overwhelming existing infrastructure?
I think one of the simplest entry points would be to understand what sensitive data an organization has, where it is, and possibly parsing also the access logs to get an idea of who's looking at what data and what are you holding. And then what would be interesting is trying to sort of run simulations of, if you were to now come up with a data protection program, what kind of disruption, how would things change? This is all doable. There's a lot of tools, and we have our own vision of how this should be done, but that's where I would start.
So speaking about the data-centric protection program, there was one question that came in. What are some of the potential pitfalls or common mistakes that organizations should avoid when building out their data protection program?
I think just monitoring alone is not enough. Like, monitoring doesn't protect. Monitoring is just very reactive. I think monitoring can be a first step, monitoring and classifying, but you actually need to protect. Thinking about malicious insiders, thinking about the data that's outside your infrastructure once it's shared, having some technical means to protect it is also important and often missed. People only think about protecting the data when it's in their infrastructure, their cloud, or under cloud tenant. But what happens if it's shared via email, via messaging, or whatever tools? Ideally, you also need to have some technical means to protect that. And then finally, any data protection today that is using cryptography, which I don't know how somebody would implement a data protection program without cryptography, needs to also take into account what's happening in that world with the new post-quantum encryption standards that have been released by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US. And over the next years, it's going to be a migration to those. So any solution needs to also be what's called crypto agile to accommodate for, I mean, I'm not saying use them today or next year, but in 2-3 years, you have to have a plan of how you're going to switch all that protection seamlessly. And then finally, also the logs and the usage, whether inside or outside the organization, need to also be analyzed to have visibility of the effectiveness of the data protection program. I think once you do all of this over the next years, your security and data protection posture is significantly improved. I mean, orders of magnitude from whatever exists today.
That's great. Thank you very much. All right, there was one more that came in that I would like to address since we have time to sneak one in. It's long. Let me get to it. So the task at hand is huge and overwhelming that we need to pile on more stuff to maybe improve things. Doesn't this mean that we're currently simply headed into the wrong direction and that we need a different paradigm shift? So this one's really about the complexity that, you know, the different layers have brought upon. Can you speak to, you know, how we can use data-centric security to really simplify our programs?
So, okay, I'm not sure what experimental things are referring to. It would be nice if the anonymous attendee. So a couple of things. One, yes, I totally actually was the idea that more complexity is not going to help. But actually, I mean, cryptography is not more complex. I mean, there's unfortunately a perceived complexity, but it's one of the most foundational and basic things. I think as the world of cybersecurity becomes more complex, we have to get back to basics. And one of the basics is cryptography. So actually, by using more cryptography, I'm arguing that you can get rid of a lot of the more complex stuff that hasn't been working. We should get brilliant about using about the basics, and cryptography is one of them. So basically what we're saying is that using data-centric approach with proper cryptography can actually obviate the need for 2 or 3 other products that you're probably using and simplify your stack, allow you to tame the number of vendors you have to deal with, and have an approach that actually works seamlessly with existing document formats and platforms. So that's not, I mean, that's not experimental, that works. The post-quantum stuff, it's up to each organization. Yes, it's not really experimental. I mean, this is a process that has been happening for a decade. And there's a huge community. At this point, it's not experimental. It works, it's efficient. It's a matter of rolling it out. There's no choice. I mean, you can argue that this experimental, sure. I'm just saying it's really a matter of time till everybody will jump on this approach, which is data is what matters. We need a fine-grained and systematic way of applying data-centric protection to all kinds of data and have it protect the data inside and outside the organization. And it's just a matter of time till this becomes part of our infrastructure. I mean, there's always a curve of there's early adopters, there's the skeptics, and there will always be skeptics. But I think it's the single most effective tool that we can deploy to make a dent in cybersecurity, I think, my opinion. But we can have different opinion on that, but time will tell.
Speaking of time, we are all out of it. Karim, Karine, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking out the time to tune in. I'm going to be sending out a recording of today's webinar on email, so you have it on hand, along with a white paper that dives even deeper into the topics that we covered today, just in case you're interested. In the meantime, feel free to connect with Karim or Karine on LinkedIn. And I'll also post a meeting link just in the chat, just in case you want to have kind of a more custom conversation about how you can implement and extend zero trust to the data level in your own organization. With that, everybody have a great day. Thanks again.
Yep. Thank you. Great. Thank you, Joe.